Chapter 3 of the Life and Adventures of Venture. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Life and Adventures of Venture, by Venture Smith. Chapter 3. Containing an account of his life, from the time of his purchasing his freedom to the present day. My wife and children were yet in bondage to Mr. Thomas Stanton. About this time I lost a chest, containing, besides clothing, about 38 pounds in paper money. It was burnt by accident. A short time after, I sold all my possessions at Stonington, consisting of a pretty piece of land and one dwelling house thereon, and went to reside at Long Island. For the first 4 years of my residence there, I spent my time in working for various people on that and at the neighboring islands. In the space of 6 months I cut and corded upwards of 400 cords of wood. Many other singular and wonderful labors I performed in cutting wood there, which would not be inferior to those just recited, but for brevity's sake I must omit them. In the aforementioned 4 years, what wood I cut at Long Island amounted to several thousand cords, and the money which I earned thereby amounted to 207 pounds 10 shillings. This money I laid up carefully by me. Perhaps some may inquire, what maintained me all the time I was laying up money? I would inform them that I bought nothing which I did not absolutely want. All fine clothes I despised in comparison with my interest, and never kept but just what clothes were comfortable for common days, and perhaps I would have a garment or two which I did not have on at all times. But as for superfluous finery, I never thought it to be compared with a decent homespun dress, a good supply of money and prudence. Expensive gatherings of my mates I commonly shunned, and all kinds of luxuries I was perfectly a stranger to. And during the time I was employed in cutting the aforementioned quantity of wood, I never was at the expense of 6 pence worth of spirits. Being after this labor 40 years of age, I worked at various places, and in particular on Ram Island, which I purchased Solomon and Cuff, 2 sons of mine, for $200 each. It will here be remembered how much money I earned by cutting wood in 4 years. Besides this I had considerable money, amounting in all to near 300 pounds. After this I purchased a negro man, for no other reason than to oblige him, and gave him 60 pounds. But in a short time after he run away from me, and I thereby lost all that I gave for him, except 20 pounds which he paid me previous to his absconding. The rest of my money I laid out in land, in addition to a farm which I owned before, and a dwelling house thereon. 44 years had then completed their revolution since my entrance into this existence of servitude and misfortune. Solomon, my eldest son, being then in his 17th year, and all my hope and dependence for help, I hired him out to one Charles Church of Rhode Island, for 1 year, on consideration of his giving him 12 pounds and an opportunity of acquiring some learning. In the course of the year, Church fitted out a vessel for a whaling voyage, and being in want of hands to man her, he induced my son to go, with the promise of giving him, on his return, a pair of silver buckles besides his wages. As soon as I heard of his going to sea, I immediately set out to go and prevent it if possible. But on my arrival at Church's, to my great grief, I could only see the vessel my son was on almost out of sight going to sea. My son died of the scurvy on this voyage, and Church has never yet paid me the least of his wages. In my son, besides the loss of his life, I lost equal to 75 pounds. My other son, being but a youth, still lived with me. About this time I chartered a sloop of about 30 tons burthen, and hired men to assist me in navigating her. I employed her mostly in the wood trade to Rhode Island, and made clear of all expenses above $100 with her in better than 1 year. I had then become something forehanded, and being in my 44th year I purchased my wife Meg, and thereby prevented having another child to buy, as she was then pregnant. I gave 40 pounds for her. During my residence at Long Island I raised 1 year with another 10 cartloads of watermelons, and lost a great many every year besides by the thievishness of the sailors. What I made by the watermelons I sold there amounted to nearly $500. Various other methods I, in order to enable me to redeem my family. In the night time I fished with set nets and pots for eels and lobsters. and shortly after went a whaling voyage in the service of Colonel Smith. After being 7 months, the vessel returned, laden with 400 barrels of oil. About this time I became possessed of another dwelling house, and my temporal affairs were in a pretty prosperous condition. This and my industry was what alone saved me from being expelled that part of the island in which I resided, as an act was passed by the select men of the place that all negroes residing there should be expelled. Next after my wife I purchased a negro man for $400, but he having an inclination to return to his old master, I therefore let him go. Shortly after I purchased another negro man for £25, who I parted with shortly after. Being about 46 years old, I bought my oldest child Hannah, of Ray Mumford, for £44, and she still resided with him. I had already redeemed from slavery myself, my wife, and 3 children, besides 3 negro men. About the 47th year of my life I disposed all my property at Long Island, and came from thence into East Haddam. I hired myself out at first to Timothy Chapman for 5 weeks, the earnings of which time I put carefully by me. After this I wrought for Abel Bingham about 6 weeks. I then put my money together and purchased of said Bingham 10 acres of land, lying at Haddam Neck, where I now reside. On this land I labored with great diligence for 2 years, and shortly after purchased 6 acres more of land contiguous to my other. 1 year from that time I purchased 70 acres more of the same man, and paid for it mostly with the produce of my other land. Soon after I bought this lot of land, I set up a comfortable dwelling house on my farm, and built it from the produce thereof. Shortly after I had much trouble and expense with my daughter Hannah, whose name has before been mentioned in this account. She was married soon after I redeemed her, to one Isaac, a free negro, and shortly after her marriage fell sick of a mortal disease. Her husband, a dissolute and abandoned wretch, paid but little attention to her in her illness. I therefore thought it best to bring her to my house and nurse her there. I procured her all the aid mortals could afford, but notwithstanding this she fell a prey to her disease after a lingering and painful endurance of it. The physician's bills for attending her during her illness amounted to £40. Having reached my 54th year, I hired 2 negro men, one named William Jacklin, and the other Mingo. Mingo lived with me 1 year, and having received his wages, run in debt to me $8, for which he gave me his note. I procured a warrant, took him, and requested him to go to Justice Throop's of his own accord, but he refusing, I took him on my shoulders, and carried him there, distant about 2 miles. The justice asking me if I had my prisoner's note with me, and replying that I had not, he told me that I must return with him and get it. Accordingly I carried Mingo back on my shoulders, but before we arrived at my dwelling he complained of being hurt, and asked me if this was not a hard way of treating our fellow creatures. I answered him that it would be hard thus to treat our honest fellow creatures. He then told me that if I would let him off my shoulders, he had a pair of silver shoe buckles, 1 shirt, and a pocket handkerchief, which he would turn out to me. I agreed, and let him return home with me on foot. But the very following night he slipped from me, stole my horse, and has never paid me even his note. The other negro man, Jacklin, being a comb maker by trade, he requested me to set him up, and promised to reward me well with his labor. Accordingly I bought him a set of tools for making combs, and procured him stock. He worked at my house about 1 year, and then run away from me with all his combs, and owed me for all his board. Since my residence at Haddam Neck, I have owned of boats, canoes, and sail vessels not less than 20. These I mostly employed in the fishing and trafficking business, and in these occupations I have been cheated out of considerable money by people whom I traded with taking advantage of my ignorance of numbers. About 12 years ago I hired a whaleboat and 4 black men, and proceeded to Long Island after a load of round clams. Having arrived there, I first purchased of James Webb, son of Orange Webb, 660 clams, and afterwards, with the help of my men, finished loading my boat. The same evening, however, this Webb stole my boat, and went in her to Connecticut River, and sold her cargo for his own benefit. I thereupon pursued him, and at length, after an additional expense of 9 crowns, recovered the boat. But for the proceeds of her cargo I never could obtain any compensation. 4 years after I met with another loss, far superior to this in value, and I think by no less wicked means. Being going to New London with a grandchild, I took passage on an Indian's boat, and went there with him. On our return, the Indian took on board 2 hogsheads of molasses, one of which belonged to Captain Elijah Hart, of Saybrook, to be delivered to his wharf. When we arrived there, and while I was gone, at the request of the Indian to inform Captain Hart of his arrival, and receive the freight for him, 1 hogshead of the molasses had been lost overboard by the people in attempting to land it on the wharf. Although I was absent at the time, and had no concern whatever in the business, and was known to a number of respectable witnesses, I was nevertheless persecuted by this conscientious gentleman, the Indian not being able to pay for it, and obliged to pay upwards of 10 pounds lawful money, with all the costs of court. I applied to several gentlemen for counsel in this affair, and they advised me, as my adversary was rich, and threatened to carry the matter from court to court till it would cost me more than the first damages would be, to pay the sum and submit to the injury, which I accordingly did, and he has often since insultingly taunted me with my unmerited misfortune. Such a proceeding as this, committed on a defenseless stranger, almost worn out in the hard service of the world, without any foundation in reason or justice, whatever it may be called in a Christian land, would in my native country be branded a crime equal to highway robbery. But Captain Hart was a white gentleman, and I a poor African, and therefore it was all right, and good enough for the black dog. I am now 69 years old. Though once straight and tall, measuring without shoes 6 feet 1 inch and a half, and every way well proportioned, I am now bowed down with age and hardship. My strength, which was once equal, if not superior, to any man whom I have ever seen, is now enfeebled so that life is a burden, and it is with fatigue that I can walk a couple of miles, stooping over my staff. Other griefs are still behind, on account of which some aged people at least will pity me. My eyesight has gradually failed, till I am almost blind, and whenever I go abroad one of my grandchildren must direct my way. Besides, for many years I have been much pained and troubled with an ulcer on one of my legs. But amidst all my griefs and pains I have many consolations. Meg, the wife of my youth, whom I married for love and bought with my money, is still alive. My freedom is a privilege which nothing else can equal. Notwithstanding all the losses I have suffered by fire, by the injustice of knaves, by the cruelty and oppression of false-hearted friends, and the perfidy of my own countrymen, whom I have assisted and redeemed from bondage, I am now possessed of more than 200 acres of land, and 3 habitable dwelling-houses. It gives me joy to think that I have, and that I deserve, so good a character, especially for truth and integrity. While I am now looking to the grave as my home, my joy for this world would be full, if my children, Cuff, for whom I paid $200 when a boy, and Solomon, who was born soon after I purchased his mother, if Cuff and Solomon, oh, that they had walked the way of their father. But a father's lips are closed in silence and grief. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. End of chapter 3. And end of The Life and Adventures of Venture. Recording by Bill Borst.